Welcome to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset, the leading data and analytics company for the cannabis industry.
Welcome back to the High Rise, a laid-back, data-back conversation on all things cannabis, where we talk about U.S. MSOs, Canadian LPs, products, and market analysis through the lens of data. I am joined, as always, by Emily Paxhia of Poseidon.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the High Rise.
So happy to be back. As I always like to say, my favorite conversation of the week. Always so much going on in the industry. Although this week, maybe a little light on the news front. I know we were just chatting about kind of summer's coming to a close. Maybe people are actually trying to enjoy themselves a little bit, not creating a bunch of headlines. But there's some stuff certainly to talk about. I think a good follow-up to last week and our great conversation with Jamie Mendola and talking about the New Jersey regulations that had just dropped, I think, right as we were going to record last week. Well, since then, for those that tuned in last week, we did talk about one of the provisions was that municipalities had to opt in or out of cannabis, and the numbers are in. And I think it's a little worse than I had thought as far as opt-in. Looks like 70% of municipalities, towns, cities in New Jersey, have actively banned cannabis, roughly 400 municipalities there. And the ones that have approved it, there's a large number that kind of approve it with caveats. I think 98 municipalities place strict zoning regulations on where these retailers or other operators could exist. And then another 41 towns basically said, yeah, you can cultivate it here, or you can run a company from here, but you can't retail it here. You can't actually sell it here. So, this was frustrating, of course. Of course, being in the industry, right? Certainly frustrating to see this kind of thing, especially frustrating given how long I feel like New Jersey's talked about legalization and how long they've had to kind of get their heads wrapped around it. And then you combine that with how many other states have legalized, and just to kind of land like this. Like, I don't know the numbers, like maybe they're like the smallest towns, and maybe the 30% that have it are the biggest municipalities. So I don't know from like a population perspective and an access perspective, but it, often is access. And something that we've talked about in the past is California, and just the recent changes that are happening in California. And that went to the ballot, and the voters changed a lot of the rules and the outright bans that were happening in California. And then to see this kind of come out of New Jersey, not the best. How do you feel about that headline?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of knew it would be a little gnarly because, as we talked about, if you opt in, you can't opt out afterwards. But if you opt out, you leave yourself the option to take more time and to decide to opt in. That being said, to your exact point, Sai, I mean, they've had a lot of time where they've been talking about this. They've also had the opportunity of watching these other markets turn on and the benefits of having a legal program within your jurisdictions. So I think it is disappointing nonetheless, but I think this is just another example. And this has been a theme, I feel like, for this year of private industry trying to move this whole thing forward, government slowing it down. And I feel like it's just because they haven't taken the time to really understand it, to understand the constituents' point of view, and to really see the benefits of it, and that it's a net positive thing when you legalize and regulate these types of businesses within your jurisdictions. As you were talking, I was just thinking maybe we could do a psychographic kind of overlay of the map to try to understand and look and see if we can extrapolate. And maybe we could even look. I know one of the things we were talking about pre-show was like, we saw this in California, and we're still seeing jurisdictions that are not allowing for legal adult use cannabis within their, the four walls of their cities. And so I think it would be really interesting to try to understand, is it politics? Is it general age of that population? Is it any religious affiliations? It would just be really curious to kind of see if there are factors that repeat throughout these different markets where this happens, because I was listening this morning. It's starting to happen in New York State. I guess they have until December 31st to decide whether or not they would like to opt in. And it's the same thing. If you opt in, you're in. If you opt out, you still can opt in down the line. And I was listening to these two mayors from the southern tier, so Western New York, south of Buffalo. One of the mayors was from a town that has struggled. Their industry has pulled out. They are seeking tax revenue, and he's very pro the industry. And it was interesting. You could hear him talking about the numbers he's researched to see what it could translate to in a town of his size. Whereas this other mayor, and because I'm from Buffalo, I know these towns. He was from another town, and it's a little bit more affluent. They haven't had the same struggles as this town. I believe they still have a pretty robust business and commerce center. And so he's very hard on, and he was like, this is what frustrated me actually more than the fact that he wanted to ban it, was that I just felt like he was perpetuating the stigma and old myth around cannabis. Like, oh, the state just pushed this through so quickly. I'm like, so quickly? It's taken years. And that they've tried to tell us it was going to be easy, but we don't really know. And then throwing around the terms of recreational and all this. And the way that they talk about it, it feels very Nancy Reagan war on drugs, cracking an egg in a frying pan. And so that is like the most disappointing part about it. But it would be really interesting to see if we could understand the trends, because it could really help us. And from an investment standpoint, it would help me to think about it, going forward. When you look at the map of New York, what's going to happen? When you look at Connecticut, what's going to happen? Rhode Island, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I think you and I have a low tolerance for these things because we've been at it for a while. But I was pretty staggered by that 70%. That was higher than I thought. I thought we'd net in around 50 to 60.
Yeah, that's a really good point about kind of an overlay, like a socioeconomic overlay, to see kind of how this plays out. And I'd have to guess it's what we would assume. Those same kind of conversations that are happening in those towns in New York probably were happening in New Jersey. Yeah, you're right. The tolerance is low. I think, after being in the industry for a decade, we're just so close to it, but maybe it's new. And the fact that individual said it's happened so fast, and we've known how long New York has taken and is still taking. It's, just funny, I guess, when you're just not that close to it every day like we are. I think it's good news for delivery. Like, just looking at, in the provisions, they cannot ban delivery. And so, I know that was another point of discussion last week. We kind of talked about the space for delivery, and delivery in cannabis is a tricky thing. It's not Amazon products leave at your door, right? It's 21 plus. You got to be there to take a delivery. But from an access perspective, I think that maybe that's a silver lining to this whole thing, that they can't prohibit delivery in these areas. So maybe there will be that access that might otherwise be lacking. The other disappointing thing is just like the zoning stuff, and just hearing about these, we were talking weeks ago about this California change where you're starting to see it on Main Street. And like this is what's going to change a lot of the perceptions, is when you just see it next to a regular old store. You don't have to go to some industrial park that's, abandoned because it's Saturday and, no one's there because all the other businesses are closed, and you got to find this one store. That's not a good experience. You really have to go out of your way. You're not just going to walk in and take a look, And so hearing that was a little disappointing too.
I mean, okay, again, I'm from Buffalo, New York. I am not casting stones here, but like, all you have to do is watch the intro segment to the credits to The Sopranos to see that the zoning in New Jersey is not precious. I mean, you can have a strip club next to a car wash, next to a Target, and it's like, there are children going up and down Route 22 seeing all of that. This is not something like, and so seeing something for, a strip club is far more impressionable than a good-looking apothecarium store that you can't even see the product. Yeah, so, I mean, let's not be too precious here about the zoning. It's not logical, and I think that's what really bothers me, and I'm sure you share that same feeling.
Yeah, certainly do, and I'm sure many of the listeners probably feel the same way. It's just getting everyone else to listen is kind of the tricky part. But yeah, we'll follow this. I think will be interesting to see how it shakes out. Maybe it's just a couple years behind where a market like California is, and we'll see on a ballot in the future municipalities, taking it to the voters to get the laws changed, to get the zoning changed, to create more access. Because as we've seen in other markets, it's always a net positive ultimately, right? By having legal cannabis, and you have legal cannabis and you ban it in your cities. people are going to still find it. People are still going to buy it. It just drives black market, and that's worse for them than a store on Main Street.
Yeah. And, the operators who are, I'm sure they're looking right now, like what jurisdictions am I next to that just banned it, and thinking about delivery into those places, because it's absolutely a strategy. So, we've seen it here in California, for example, just north of the Golden Gate Bridge, and, Sausalito and Tiburon, very affluent areas where people are absolutely consumers of cannabis. And so operators in Sonoma deliver down into those areas, or operators in San Francisco proper are going right over the bridge. So it's not like you're not going to get it. You're just not going to benefit from the tax revenue. So
exactly. It all seems so obvious. So speaking of California, another headline this week was that they finalized the Department of Cannabis Control, or the DCC. It's led by Director Nicole Elliott, who is an advisor to Gavin Newsom, who we both have had the privilege of interacting with. In her previous role, I think she was doing a lot of good. So I'm really excited to see what they can do for the California market here. Some notable things about this office: it combined a few different departments. So for those that are in California, that maybe in the industry listening, probably have dealt with a lot of these challenges from, regulation and licensing and enforcement, and going into 3 different agencies. And now, having it in one, I can see be a lot more straightforward for a business operator, instead of having to figure out who do I call for these things, or, who's going to ask me questions from what department. You have one group now. They've got a budget of about $150 million, a team of about 400 people. And apparently the goal of the agency is to ultimately boost the number of businesses participating in the legal market, ease the licensing process for applicants, and keep licensed operators compliant. So ultimately just trying to drive this. And, you're in California here, so what should we expect from this?
Yeah, well, first of all, I am very happy and excited for Nicole. I think it's a pretty immense undertaking. So I'm sending her good vibes, because that's a tough job. But, we've known Nicole for a few years. She was involved in San Francisco, and I still remember sitting down to breakfast with her and thinking, wow, this is I know sometimes I get frustrated with regulators, but in this instance, I feel like she is somebody. I remember sitting down to breakfast with her and talking about the industry, and she was clearly somebody who had taken a lot of time to get to talk to people in the business of cannabis, people who wanted to get into the business, and understanding the challenges that exist. And I feel like she has a real empathy for the industry. And in fact, she's been so gracious as to take my calls, over the years, just to kind of share my perspective as an investor and what I think could drive more capital back into the state of California to support the industry. And she's always given me very helpful insights and feedback. So I think she is honestly one of the best shepherds that could have been selected for this group, but it is an immense undertaking. And, I saw you pulled together some of the stats around this, and just having been in California, having worked with operators who have had provisional licenses, who've tried to cross over to having the full active annual licenses, it's been an extraordinarily difficult and backed up situation. And so, and we also knew this, like Lori Ajax, way back when Proposition 64 passed and we were getting this thing through to open the industry, the new adult use market. She was like, we just even have a manpower issue because the state is so massive. There are so many people who want to gain access to the industry that just actually physically getting this done is a feat that's almost, it's really crazy. So yeah, you pulled the stat, 8,649 active provisional licenses. And that represents 75% of all state licenses. And this is all according to the governor's office. There are only 2,834 active annual licenses. And so that just goes to show that we're years into this, and we're still so behind on getting this thing fully stood up on its feet. And I've been in a few businesses that have had real struggles with that. So I think what we're seeing here is the state's trying to streamline this by bringing this together into one organization and really trying to think about how they can support the industry, because the industry is going through tough times. Again, here in California, there's a lot of talk about the amount of flower that's going to be entering the market on the backside of this harvest. And I think you only have to look at some of the rhymes of what happened in Colorado and Oregon in past years, and we could be facing severe price compression. And that's what the whole industry is bracing for here. So I think everybody would like to just at least focus on business situations like that, not whether or not after, I mean, how many years has it been now? Like
Almost
three and a half years, almost 4. Yeah. That we still don't have these full active licenses. And so I think it's just, everyone's like, please, can we just focus on the business side of it? So we'll see.
What is it about the provisional licenses versus the active annual licenses? Like, what, do you have any sense of like why there is such a disparity between the two? Like what makes it so challenging to issue these licenses?
I'm not actually 100% sure. I do think it has to do with site inspections and actual, like the physical challenges for the license office to be able to actually get around and visit these places and say, yes, this is a blessed operation. I think that's one of the big things. And then I think it is just, I think a lot of the license applications have errors in them. And so then they have to be corrected. You got to get them back and then get back in. And then there's just the sheer mass of it.
Yeah, no, great points. And it kind of, your earlier comment around the New York, around the Buffalo area, that person mentioning that it was going to be hard or challenging to roll out these programs. And maybe this is what they're alluding to. I do know that California, has that recent grant that they approved, and it's $100 million. And apparently that is going to go to local governments to help move them from the provisional to annual. So maybe it is like a resourcing thing. Like, these jurisdictions might not have the resources to do that site visit and to make sure everything is good to go. And so maybe having this capital and deploying it through this new DCC will accelerate that. And I'm sure if they can pull it off, it should give a lot of peace of mind to people in the California market. As far as licensing, of course, they've got the pricing challenges potentially on the horizon and all the other things. But California, as a market, is doing really well. It had its largest month ever in July, almost 450 million in sales. And that's pre-tax. I mean, that's, I think, the biggest ever, which, will continue to grow with access and with these new stores being able to open. At Headset, we track, it's, roughly 900 distinct brands that are selling products, well over 20,000 distinct products, in the market through these brands. And these brands that we track are not necessarily, independent license holders. Sometimes it's one license holder that will introduce a number of brands, but there's a lot of them out there. And then, those provisional licenses that we're talking about, I mean, that goes across the board, right? Not just the product manufacturers, but, retailers. And when I say brands, I'm talking about like CPG brands, like not retail brands specifically. Anyways, it's really great actually to see California kind of being progressive and investing and like trying to make this work and like being pretty active. You don't see that in every market. You see it maybe in local, cities like Denver, doing some stuff with on-premise or delivery, but a lot of them just kind of roll it out in minor changes and then that's it. So let's hope for the best, I guess, with California here.
No, I mean, I think that's one of the things that I am encouraged by with this is that there is a commitment to trying to continue to foster the industry. It is funny how it does feel hard here. It's such a huge state. I mean, it's the 5th largest economy in the world. And so we're navigating so many challenges at that mass scale level, not to mention cannabis. And then, you're absolutely right. And it's important to take a step back and ground ourselves in the data. I mean, almost $450 million in one state or in 1 month.
1 month, state. Yeah.
It's really extraordinary. And that's not something to disregard. And then when I think about where it could go, once the market really does start competing against the illicit market and we pull all of that into the legal system, I mean, there's so much upside to unlock in this state. So it's tough. We do get, a little bit bogged down a little sometimes because it's been such a monster to get this program going, but there's so much good here. And that's why we're invested here too. So. Yeah.
Well, exciting to see, how this goes. And it is a big task for Nicole Elliott with this, but seems like the right person for the job. So yeah, wishing her the best. And it'll be fun to watch kind of how this translates, because it has been kind of a hot button issue for a long time, these provisional licenses.
Yeah, I can't think of a person who would be more capable to take it on. So I think we have to support them, and we will.
So one of the things I know California has is consumption lounges. And speaking of licenses, and I haven't seen that many out there. There could be a lot more than what I've been exposed to, but it seems pretty light. But the headline this week is that Nevada is setting up for their consumption lounges for next year in 2022. And I think it's an interesting, in my head, sometimes I equate Nevada with Las Vegas. Certainly Nevada is a bigger state than Las Vegas, and it has, more going on than Las Vegas, but Las Vegas is a big driver. Clark County is a big driver of cannabis sales, right? And I think that's because a lot of people are coming through there, tourists visiting, things are sort of opening up. I keep saying that every week because you kind of never know with COVID and which way it's going, but people are traveling, people are visiting places like Las Vegas, and it seems like a good area, like Nevada, Las Vegas in general, to open up consumption lounges, so if you're visiting, you can drop in, not only purchase cannabis, but consume it on site, right? Because there's nowhere you can, you can't in the hotel rooms, can't on the street. Obviously people are finding ways to do it, but having these lounges seems like a good fit. And question I have, like, what do you think, Emily, about, the model, like, is because I don't think a lot of people think about cannabis and consumption lounges yet. I don't think that it's there. It's like when people think about alcohol, they might think about bars, right? But I don't think that consumption lounges and cannabis are like that tightly connected in people's minds yet, just because the access hasn't been there. Like it's really more rare than not. But do you think Nevada has an opportunity to change that? And is that for the better? Or is it going to be associated with like, oh, I go to Las Vegas and I can gamble and I can consume cannabis, and you can do everything, and it becomes associated more with that versus something different?
So I think that it's a great stage to really introduce the concept of social consumption lounges to the market. It is the cross section of America. You get every, cut of person through there in many different ways. And so it's a great place for it because it's really kind of an amazing cross section of humans. So I think that it could be a great place. I think Vegas is all about hospitality and experience. And I think if anyone's going to do a really fun and interesting approach to a consumption lounge, it'll happen there first. And, as we've talked about these cannabis superstores with the experience-based retail, like the Planet 13, I almost called it Planet Hollywood, which is like maybe what these consumption lounges will be like. But, I think that it'll be very interesting. And I could see it definitely being a tourist attraction. Like there's a lot of bachelor and bachelorette parties that go there. There's a novelty to it. So let's go to the consumption lounge, kind of as how people used to go or still go to the coffee shops in Amsterdam. But I'm sure this will have a different and kind of party forward vibe, or maybe experiential. I mean, maybe I don't know, if I were going to do it, I would incorporate some really cool music and visual content to the whole scene. So I'm sure there's going to be really fun, interesting ways they'll approach it. But maybe that'll be a springboard for how people get more used to thinking about it in that way. Because I think you're absolutely right. Everyone thinks to go to a bar or to a coffee shop to share the experience of consuming a beverage, but you don't necessarily think of the same thing around cannabis. Although a lot of cannabis is socially consumed when you think about groups of people and pass the Dutchie and all those great things that go on with social sharing of cannabis. But I'm pretty pumped for it. I wouldn't characterize myself as a Vegas person, but I think that they don't lack imagination. They really go for it. And so, I don't know, I'm all for experience around this. So I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. And it'll be cool. Like long term, it'd be neat if you saw some of the big casinos or the big hotels finding a way to adopt it, if at all possible. Again, it's like zoning and all of that, but it would seem like they would have some leverage with the city. But I could see like some hip hotels trying to bring that in as another differentiator for like a new crowd coming through. Come here to this spot and you can consume cannabis. But certainly in the beginning, it's going to be the Planet 13s. It's going to be kind of, I mean, they're already doing a great job with kind of the attracting a sizable audience, and, you know, having the ability to consume on site, I think will only benefit them. So yeah, and the great comment about the cross section, you know, with travel opening up and events starting to open up. I mean, Vegas has always been like a hub for conferences, and you have things like CES, you know, that drives a lot of people. And so getting that exposure, again, all back to normalization, and then maybe it'll accelerate things in other markets. Because, you know, I feel like every podcast I'm here in Seattle complaining about like how slow, like we don't have delivery, and we don't have consumption lounges. It's like, we're just like, you know, we one of the first, you know, right behind Colorado by a few months, and, you know, still stuck here, not getting all this fun stuff. So, who knows if, you know, progress in other markets translates not necessarily always to Washington, but hopefully to other markets, and maybe eventually here to Washington State as well.
Yeah, I mean, California does have consumption lounges. They are often banned by jurisdictions even more than other types of places of cannabis, but you know, I believe they're allowing them in some of the Central Coast towns. We've had them here in San Francisco for a while. LA is allowing them. I mean, unfortunately, I think many of them were going to like really open up for the first time right before COVID. And that's also not a great time for that to be happening. Or they had opened and then COVID hit. So we'll have to see. But yeah, sometimes you have to go to where like the big splash happens for people to shift their perceptions. So.
Yeah. And one of the topics we touched on last week, Jamie, was the beverages. Mm-hmm. And, you know, kind of back to the bar analogy, certainly beverages and consumption lounges would be a good fit, right? Because of the issue with smoking, and, you know, people not wanting to be around smoke and inhaling smoke. And, you know, with some of the beverages and some of the more fast onset behavior beverages, and also fast onset technology we're seeing in edibles, like maybe there's something there too that maybe they'll synergistically kind of go hand in hand and drive more adoption there. So fingers crossed for sure. In other news, other state news, so now on to Florida. Headline since we recorded last week: Leafly, a company I was once very close to, for those who don't listen or don't know, it was one of the founders of Leafly prior to Headset, has recently filed a legal challenge against Florida regulators, claim that online marijuana e-commerce companies like Leafly are violating a state law banning third-party cannabis dispensing services. So basically, Florida is saying, hey, Leafly, you guys are a third-party cannabis dispensing service. And it's funny because, you know, funny, I'm sure they don't think it's funny, but, you know, Leafly, back in 2010, when we started it in 2011, and post the Privateer acquisition, we, you know, ended up selling Leafly to Privateer, now Tilray. We like spent so much time trying to stay as far away from the product of cannabis itself, in the sense of like plant touching, as we could, like just arm's length. And it was early days, and it sounds crazy to think about those days, but you know, it really was like Wild West. Like we didn't know, you know, like would we be bucketed with, you know, stuff that's maybe considered, you know, illegal in whatever capacity? How much is the federal government going to come down on this stuff as it expands? You know, now 10 years later, you're looking back and it's like federal government hasn't done anything, but those were like the heady days of raids and stuff. Like dispensaries would get raided all the time. And so, you know, we took a lot of effort to just be like, oh, we're, you know, tangential to the industry, or a technology company, you know, we're not plant touching. And I think, you know, Leafly's still arguing that case. And as they're saying, you know, going up against Florida, saying, look, we are not a third-party cannabis dispensing service. So, this is more than Leafly, obviously. There's a lot of companies that are doing kind of what Leafly's doing with the online menus and the checkout for pre-order, connecting delivery, companies like Dutchie, companies like iHeart Jane. But it is interesting to see Leafly challenging this and arguing that they do not fit in this model. Maybe the timing fits. You know, Leafly is planning on going public at the end of the year, they've announced. Maybe it's part of it. Maybe Florida to them is a big, important market. Maybe they want to capture the Florida market. Obviously, Florida as a market does really well. But, you know, one thing I took away from this is like, you know, when you think just to that previous topic about, you know, things happening in one state and getting adopted by another state, if this is held up by Florida and they say you are a third-party dispensing service, is there a risk of other states kind of following suit and saying, look, we only want to keep the license holders handling this stuff, which seems like really hard for the states to pull that off because you're just a service provider, right? It's like, are they going to go after the websites, people making the websites or hosting the websites for these retailers and say, you're a retailer? I think, what Florida's trying to say is because you have a shopping cart and you facilitate that, but there's all sorts of shopping cart services that companies use. Do they all become third-party dispensing services? Seems like a stretch, but anyways, we'll see how this plays out. Do you think that this is something that we would see happening anywhere else, or is this just a Florida thing?
Is this just Florida man being Florida man? Okay, so a couple of thoughts here. I agree with you. I think that when you look back way back in our world with Uber, they had to fight really hard when the states were trying to characterize them in certain ways with the contract versus full-time employee challenges. And I know some of the folks that were on the legal teams there, and yes, absolutely, they were trying to fight it because they didn't want precedent to be set. Because as they were opening into new markets, they didn't want all of a sudden the state to try to say, well, that's what they did, so we should do that too. Florida, I don't know. I've been trying to think about, as you were talking, the motivations of who would be going against them. And I'm trying to understand if it is the operators within the state trying to consolidate power. We know that's been kind of a Florida move. And so I'm trying, maybe I'm not thinking about it right, but it does.
It's pretty interesting, actually. The Leafly model is very much an aggregator model, right? So you go to Leafly, you're the consumer, and you're looking for something, maybe a particular strain, maybe a particular brand. That might not work in Florida because of the vertical integration, and a lot of these dispensaries are very brand specific. But even if I guess you were looking for a specific brand or a specific product, ultimately, Leafly wants to own that relationship with the consumer, right? And says, okay, you come here first and we'll connect you to that strain. And that strain may be available at any of these locations. Or, this brand, it's only sold at this location, but we're gonna handle this transaction. And maybe you're right. Maybe those that are there say, we want to own this relationship. I do see a world where, that's like, it's the Uber Eats model, right? It's like when you talk to people with restaurants about Uber Eats, it's like they have to, and DoorDash and all the others, right? They have to be on these platforms for discovery, right? And to kind of keep the lights on with business, especially today, right? With all the challenges with COVID, but it does drive business for them. But at the same time, it's a disintermediary between them and the customer. So they don't really know much about the customer. They don't know maybe why the customer came and ordered from them or ordered that food, or how they even liked the food, right? They might rate the driver that comes through, but there's no connection, right? And restaurants want that connection. So it's a double-edged sword. And so I could see how maybe operators in Florida are saying, look, we want to own that relationship. I think not just Florida, every operator wants to own that relationship. Every restaurant owner wants to own the relationship with the person coming through the door, but they also want to sell more stuff. And so it's like using these platforms. So that push and pull. So maybe that is the motivator.
Yeah, whenever something like this happens, I always try to think about who's driving it, because it is a divorce from how it's been perceived in every other state that it's existed in. And so I'm like, but we know that Florida has a very interesting business culture around cannabis, and there's been a lot of holding things pretty tightly down there, and the competition is pretty fierce because there are a lot of doors now there are more and more opening at a very rapid rate. So I could see that it would be coming to the point where you're trying to own the customer from their entry point on the web into their path through the store. So I think we should tweet at Brady Cobb on this one and see if he has some specific input, because I don't know many people that know Florida better than him. But maybe we'll have Kim on the show sometime, and she could elucidate us to the Florida way. So yeah, I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Curious to watch, because to your point, it doesn't just have implications to Leafly. It has implications to other technology companies. And I think a lot of us believe that technology is one of the most important pieces for not just the consumer experience, but also for improving B2B efficiency. So it's something to watch.
Totally. And it's a great comment about Brady. I was going to say the same thing, getting back on the show to enlighten us on Florida. But Kim from Trulieve would be just as good. maybe as this stuff plays out, we can kind of get to the bottom of it. We'll see what's going on, if there's more to come from this. So other headlines, this kind of cannabis related, not cannabis related, but I think there's certainly a connection. All this news around OnlyFans. So those following tech and, following what's going on with OnlyFans and their transition away from adult content. Although now it sounds like they're walking that back a little bit, maybe as of today, pretty recently. But, just given, cannabis and particularly adult use cannabis, has some, vice clause type situation. There is potentially some overlap there. Any lessons you think or anything we can learn from this?
So OnlyFans, it's a platform for creators. I think you can ascertain by the headlines that there was a lot of adult content on this platform. And I think it was probably the number one reason that they saw massive revenue growth and adoption rates. In fact, there are a lot of parallels to cannabis and the adult content industry, where they were trailblazers in technology, around formats for viewing content like the VHS and all of these things. Like, people are motivated by certain things, and sex is one of them. So anyway, OnlyFans had this meteoric rise to broad recognition and understanding, and now they're going out for a capital raise, which I'd love to understand why they need to raise money or feel compelled to, other than maybe they're going to try to go public. But I mean, I can only imagine the amount of cash that business is throwing off. And it's good for the creators too, because they actually make good money on the platform, which they deserve. And so last week they announced that they were going to go out and raise capital, and that they were going to divest the adult content portion of the site because it was limiting investment from private equity firms and venture capital firms, because many of them have vice clauses, and vice clauses can include everything from tobacco to sex to guns, and in many cases cannabis, because of the federal status of cannabis. I have known many, many fund managers outside of cannabis that have been held back on being able to deploy capital into the industry. And so this is very relevant to what we experience here. It holds back institutional capital to be categorized as a vice, or to be kind of put in this silo separate from other consumer products, for example, or in this instance, other media. And it is interesting because, as Sai and I were talking about in the pre-show, it's over 21, it's a high growth segment, it's a loyal segment of the population, and, people that are return customers, it's sticky customer bases. So, it's just one of those things that I was really sad to see that OnlyFans was kind of turning on such a strong aspect of their platform in order to get around this vice clause. But then today, just on Twitter, and I was joking, like I was going to leave my career in cannabis to go launch the the answer to this problem of the real OnlyFans, or Only Cool Fans. I think that they're now walking that back. So I don't know how that happened or what's going on. I do know there are some investment groups who have purposefully gone after the aspect of the industry that others carve out. So they do go after quote unquote vice industries on purpose. And I think it's because they understand, the attractive nature of those industries in terms of revenue profiles and growth. So maybe that's how they got around it.
Yeah. The attractive industries, and also maybe not as competitive, right? Because of those vice clauses. And so there's less potentially people at the table competing for those investments. So not a bad strategy, but certainly like the walking back of it today might be a good signal. Like maybe, for our industry, I've heard that a lot as well. And, we're on the data side, right? We're ancillary, and you still get wrapped up in the vice clause, and the vice clauses are like venture capital has these clauses to say like we can't get into alcohol, but that basically means like you can't introduce a new vodka brand and it's backed by them, right? But being kind of arm's length from it, we still get caught up in that. And then that for the brands, the people that are producing the products themselves, and they certainly have no chance of getting any investment from that kind of venture groups that are out there. So this maybe is a good signal. Maybe I've talked to a lot of people that have said, yeah, we have these clauses. Yeah, we're going to try and get rid of them, so maybe it's just legacy stuff. It's probably stuff that's boilerplate that's just rolled and rolled and rolled since whatever, the 60s or whenever venture capital kind of really started up. But yeah, maybe that's a good sign.
Yeah, I mean, as a someone with a financial firm, I know our documents, you don't try to reinvent the wheel. So you try to use similar documents. We actually just went through a whole process of reviewing ours and changing, frankly, our risk disclosures, because the cannabis industry has changed and it's just different. When we first were doing this in 2013, our first set of documents, it was a very different landscape. And so it was kind of fun to see the lawyers had redlined out some of the ones that were in there originally. And it was nice to see them go. So yeah, maybe we all need to take a look at our docs again before we go out and raise more money, so we have more optionality.
Yeah, not a bad idea. As we wrap up here, anything new on your side? Anything you want to chat about?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I forgot. So this Sunday, I'm coming back to so that'll be the 22nd. Oh, no, that was last week. The Hurricane Henri ruined the party last week. But on the 29th of August, I'll be back out east. We'll be at the Hamptons for the Hamptons Cannabis Expo. And I think it's going to be really well attended so far. I'm hearing it's going to be hundreds of people. There will be some exhibitors there and really interesting, lively panels with some of the, the fund managers in the industry, as well as some of the operators. And so I think it'll be pretty cool. So if you're out there, maybe put the tennis racket down, head on over to the Hamptons Cannabis Expo and come hear us talk about it, because it should be a good event. It'll be nice to see a lot of the East Coast people. There's a lot of, I know, Sai, you and I were in New York a couple months ago, and I was just there. There's a real energy around cannabis on the East Coast right now, and I find it very invigorating. I feel like I'm plugging into a new and fresh excitement around this, and it's a good reminder so that we don't, take it for granted that we have legal cannabis here in the western part of the country, and that people are just so excited for it to turn on. So I find it to be refreshing.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, I wish I could be there with you. It sounds like a good time. And I'm sure you guys will talk a lot about all this New York stuff. And I'm sure New Jersey stuff as well will be very, very topical to hear from all those groups that are there. But yeah, have a good time. Hopefully no more hurricanes. I heard it ended up kind of being a dud for the Hamptons in particular, but probably good they moved it regardless. That would have been not ideal.
Yeah, we had the markets have just been taking a bath in cannabis in spite of how good the businesses are. And the hurricane path was basically destined to land on the venue for the event. And we were like, we're not an industry with a lot of luck on our side these days. So maybe let's not play with meteorological fire on that one. Let's all be safe.
Well, very cool. Well, have a good time. I think that'll do it this week. Thanks everyone for listening. Please be sure to rate us on your favorite podcast apps and tell all your friends. And looking forward to next week and what we'll be talking about then.
Thanks for listening to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset. For more information on Headset, visit headset.io.